Madam Clerk,
Oral questions by members.
official House Leader, Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has completely failed to explain the basic elements of his travel ban since his botched announcement on Monday. Yesterday, 11 legal and First Nations groups wrote to express their outrage. Groups like the BC Civil Liberties Association, Union of BC Indian Chiefs, BC First Nations Justice Council, British Columbia Assembly of First Nations, First Nations Summit Society, and the Pivot Legal Society, to name a few. And I quote from the letter, "The lack of information and details about the order has raised many alarm bells, especially in the middle of a global and local reckoning about systemic racism in policing and policing powers," end quote. Can the Premier explain exactly what he announced 4 days ago, or does the Premier still not know?
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member. As the member knows, there is a pandemic going on, and one of the issues around the transmission of the virus has been travel. What was indicated on Monday is that we would be needing to bring in travel restrictions. We have made it clear that there would be information coming out later this week, which will be tomorrow. The opposition has already been informed that they will be being briefed on the proposed changes that are taking place. We are very mindful of the issues that have been raised in that letter and by others, and I note that many of those concerns have been raised at earlier points in the pandemic when government has had to put in place health orders. We will be doing everything that we need to do to ensure that not only are those concerns addressed, but we've already made it clear that there will be, and I note that the opposition, when the measure of the need for travel restrictions came out, automatically jumped the gun and said, oh, they're going to be preventing people from going about their business, going to work, which nothing could be further from the truth. But as I've said, Honourable Speaker, we will have more details coming out on Friday, and the opposition has already been scheduled for a fulsome briefing on the issues involved.
Opposition House Leader on supplemental.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The letter points out exactly what the concerns of many in the province have been expressing this week, including many constituents to our office, because an announcement on Monday about measures that will take effect on Friday, but no information till Friday, leads to confusion. So again, this letter from the 11 legal societies as well as First Nations groups points out that announcing orders to regulate the movement of people should have the consent of First Nations. But once again, this Premier has completely ignored UNDRIP. This is what the letter from those 11 groups has to say, and I quote, "It is concerning to us that the government would make two public announcements in such a vague way with no accompanying details. And the comments of the Premier and the Solicitor General are different from one another, which adds to the confusion," end quote. Again, can the Premier tell British Columbians why there are conflicting comments and total confusion coming from him and his government?
Solicitor General.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. There are no conflicting comments coming from the Solicitor General or the Premier or from this government. What has been made clear right from the very beginning, that there are health orders that need to be in place to deal with the spread of the virus. And that means limiting travel between health authorities as one of the most effective ways to do that. That's what has been announced. What was also made clear.
Members.
What is also.
Second. Members. Question was asked. Let's listen to the answer.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And I think that illustration of not wanting to hear the answer just confirms, in fact, what took place on Monday when the opposition went out right away on Twitter to say, oh, the government intends to prevent people from being able to go to work. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're not really interested. They're clearly not really interested in wanting to try and control a pandemic when they make statements like that. we have made it clear that 1, they will be being briefed tomorrow. 2, that will be before the order goes out. But most importantly, that there is a need to be able to control transmission. And that means recognizing that travel restrictions have to be put in place. We have also made it clear that essential travel will still take place. And that list will also be coming out on Friday. But use some common sense on the other side of the House. That does not mean preventing people from being able to go to work. That does not mean preventing people from going and getting groceries, for example. What it means is asking people to do what we are already telling them to do, asking them to do, which is to stay in their own health authority, stay local. That's what the travel restrictions are about. The details will be announced on Friday. The Premier on Monday, as myself, have foreshadowed what is to come. And it's been made clear that that's what's taking place, and it's unfortunate that the opposition is choosing to play politics on such a serious...
Thank you, Mr. Member for Peace River South.
Well, thank you. I mean, the messaging coming from this minister and the premier and this government is about clear as mud. I mean, there is endless flip-flopping that's taking place from the premier on travel restrictions. First, he said he needed legal advice. Then he said he couldn't do it. Then he let skiers travel here from all across the continent to go skiing. And then 2 weeks ago, he shrugged and said, well, what are we going to do? Quote, arrest them? End quote. Now the flip-flopping premier is at it again, announcing essential travel only with police-enforced travel bans, with no details, but worse, he caught the police completely off guard and they knew nothing about this. It's no wonder every time the premier opens up his mouth, everybody in the province gets confused with his comments. So can the premier define easily today, what does he mean by essential travel?
Solicitor General.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, I must admit, the only flip-flopping is coming from that side of the House. Clearly they've decided they're not really interested in working with this side of the House or the House together in terms of dealing with the pandemic. That's what and I can inform. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And I can also inform the member that he is factually wrong on one of his statements in his question. And that is, we have been working very closely with police in terms of how an order on travel between health authorities could be enforced. And that work has been ongoing. And like I said, you're being briefed tomorrow. And you knew you're being briefed tomorrow, so it's unfortunate, but I guess it's to their advantage in a way to say, oh, well, we don't know any details, so we'll go in there and play politics, as opposed to waiting till a scheduled briefing they're supposed to be getting tomorrow. That says everything you need to know about that side of the House.
Okay, one question at a time. Member for Peace River South.
Well, thank you, Speaker. The confusion starts because of the flip-flopping that's taking place on that side of the House. The confusion starts every time the Premier opens up his mouth. We asked for a briefing and explanation starting Monday, and instead they wait till a few minutes before question period today. Don't worry, we'll brief you tomorrow as we're making the public announcements to the province. Here's the confusion the government's causing. Last Friday, the Minister of Health claimed that there would be no travel restrictions in British Columbia. And then on Monday, the Premier announced full travel ban, complete with police checkpoints. He said, and I quote, "These will be conducted through random audits, not unlike any roadside checks," end quote. And ever since then, this Solicitor General has been trying to clean up the Premier's mess with different messaging yet again, adding more confusion for the people of British Columbia who are trying to understand the direction this province is trying to go. So can the Premier let the people of BC know who is right? Is it the Minister of Health? Is it the Solicitor General or is it the Premier? Who should they be listening to?
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. As the members on that side of the House well know, the pandemic creates a very fluid situation. We respond to the needs that happen as that pandemic is evolving and that pandemic is changing. We listen to the advice of the provincial health officer. It has become clear that what needs to be in place are travel restrictions. We have indicated that that is what is going to take place. That work on how that will happen has been underway. It has involved police agencies, for example, on how something could take place. What tools are required? It's involved working with BC Ferries, for example. Again, that work has been taking place. And I want to again correct the member across the way. They were informed yesterday, not a few minutes before question period today, that you would be getting briefed. And we will brief you when when there's information in place. So
Members.
you were told yesterday, and your opposition leader asked me. She said, I've written you a letter and I want to have a briefing. And I said, we are setting one up for you. And your critic was also informed. So once again, Honourable Speaker, they prove
Waving a paper doesn't change it.
Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Okay.
Members, that part of the question and answer is over, please. Let's continue with the next question. Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, the Premier promised during the recent SNAP election to implement all the Old Growth Review Panel's recommendations, including immediate protections for at-risk old growth and a paradigm shift with fully funded transition plans for communities. As the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and conservation groups have made extremely clear, a shift away from old growth logging simply will not happen without adequate funding, including conservation financing and funding for Indigenous-led protected areas. Yet there is nothing in this budget. The Wilderness Committee called this lack of funding, quote, a recipe to increase division and conflict over old growth forests in this province. My question is to the Minister of Finance, who ultimately is responsible for what is and what is not in the budget. Where is the funding needed to support the promises made to protect old growth and support communities through a shift in our forestry sector?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for the question. Our government is committed and dedicated to implementing the recommendations of the Independent Panel on Old Growth. And you will see in the budget that we have increased forestry's budget by $44 million this year over the previous budget. And again, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that the work, this important work, has already begun, and the important work of engaging with all interested parties is absolutely critical. We want to have a solution that works for everybody, and making sure that we engage with Indigenous governments across the regions are absolutely critical to making sure that we can do this important work.
Member for Saanich North and Islands on supplemental.
Minister of Finance, when pressed by the media on how they would fund enhanced old growth protection, said it would come from within Flinro's budget. This morning, the Finance Minister on CBC said the forestry budget was increased, which is not highlighted. But the Finance Minister knows that the Flinro's budget is actually decreasing. $41 million this year, $30 million next year. As Andrea Innes from the Ancient Forest Alliance said, quote, despite promising a complete paradigm shift in the way BC forests are managed, the NDP government's 2021 budget is bereft of meaningful solutions to make it happen, end quote. This budget confirms what many have been worried about, that the BC NDP's promises to do things differently on land use, on forestry, and on old growth protection are just empty words. My question is actually Andrea's question from their press release yesterday, again to the Minister of Finance, who's responsible for these decisions. Quote, how does the province expect to protect ancient forest ecosystems, support communities, and overhaul its forest management regime with less funding than it had before, end quote.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, again, I want to point out, just how important that work is and that the work has already begun. The Forest Minister is diligently engaging with all interested parties, and that we have increased forestry budget by $44 million this year over last year. It is in the budget. And I also want to point out that we did provide, and perhaps this might be helpful to the discussion, is that we did provide emergency funding for an additional $85 million last year in the midst of the pandemic, because it was a pandemic. And I do want to point out that we do have a significant pandemic and recovery contingency should we need to continue to support the forestry sector as part of the pandemic and as part of our recovery.
Member for Kelowna Mission.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, the Premier has flipped, flopped, and bungled when it comes to travel restrictions for BC. The Solicitor General, the Health Minister, and the Public Health Officer have all provided advice to the public that directly contradicts him. But the Premier just keeps blowing it. People are wondering, can we go to work? Can we visit ailing parents? What if I have a medical appointment? How are people expected to provide evidence that their travel is essential? Will people have to produce sensitive personal information at these check stops?
Government House Leader.
No.
Member for Kelowna Mission Supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, that's the first straight answer we've received. So this is what the Premier said on Monday, and I quote, "Everybody who goes by will be asked where they're going and where they came from," end quote. The words of the Premier. But according to the BC Civil Liberties Association, they say, and I quote, "Police do not have the legal authority to ask questions like, where are you going? Where are you coming from? For what purpose?" End quote. Can the Premier explain what specific powers, then, the police will have to enforce this order at a checkpoint?
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. As been made clear on Monday, this is about restricting travel to deal with the pandemic and the spread of the virus, and in particular, what we've seen over the last while, which is the increase in variants in this province. Now, if the opposition is all of a sudden opposed to dealing with that, let the public of British Columbia know. If the opposition doesn't believe that the government should be doing everything it can to deal with this virus and the spread of this virus, and
Members, the
British
chair would
Columbians
like to
safe,
listen to the answer,
let
please.
the public know.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, what the public is looking for, what British Columbians are looking for, is clarity and honesty, not a bungling Premier and a blustering Solicitor General. This is what the Premier said on Monday, and I quote, "The Minister of Public Safety will be using the Emergency Program Act to restrict people's ability to move from one health authority to another. It will be done in a way that includes everyone, and there will be consequences if you are outside of your area on non-essential business," end quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, since the Premier winged it on Monday, our constituency offices have been flooded with calls from frustrated and confused constituents. British Columbians want to know what the Premier actually meant, but we don't know what to tell them. So the question is this: can the Premier explain why 4 days later he still can't explain what's happening with checkpoints and travel restrictions?
Solicitor General.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And it'd be nice, if the opposition would be honest with its constituents when they call in, because the provincial health officer has already said travel advisories in place, which is stay in your own community. That if you have to ask about going somewhere else, don't do it. So, Honourable Speaker, if that's the kind of misinformation that they're giving their constituents when they phone their office, then I say shame on them. order, the travel restrictions, the travel.
Members,
The travel restrictions that we have been talking about, that we have indicated need to be put in place. We've made clear those will be announced on Friday. What the Premier did appropriately was to foreshadow that we are having to take this step. We don't want, he would rather not have to take this step, but the virus and the variants are spreading through this province, and travel is one of the ways in which they are transmitted, and one of the most effective ways to deal with that is to bring in travel restrictions, and the provincial health officer has indicated that between health authorities is the most effective way to do that. That will ensure that in the Lower Mainland, you stay in the Lower Mainland. If you're in the interior and Northern Health, that's where you need to stay. It is not about, and it has been clear.
members, let's listen to the answer.
And it has been clear, it is not going to impact on essential travel, such as medical appointments and going to work or commuting, between Burnaby and Vancouver. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, Honourable Speaker. It is unfortunate, Honourable Speaker, that once again they're not interested in working together. They're more interested in playing politics.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson on supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say the definition of playing politics is calling an election in the middle of a pandemic. And that's on all of you. And I would also say to the Solicitor General, I know it must be frustrating that the Premier's press conference these days can basically be summed up as show up and screw up. He shows up and then he puts stuff out there and leaves it to the Solicitor General to come in behind and clean up the Premier's mess. I understand that that must be frustrating. But it's also frustrating for British Columbians to have no idea what the Premier meant when he said, again, and I quote, "The Minister of Public Safety will be using the Emergency Program Act to restrict people's ability to move from one health authority to another," end quote. That's the Premier's quote. That's not something that we said, and we also know that that's not something that the Solicitor General said. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier think it's essential for people to get to their jobs that cross a boundary that he's drawn? Does the Premier think it's essential for people to take care of their frail elderly parents in another health authority? The Premier can't define essential. He can't explain the consequences. And he can't explain why there's one set of rules in the Lower Mainland and apparently another set of rules in other parts of British Columbia. So again, the question to the Premier is this: will the Premier tell British Columbians more about these checkpoints that they can expect and what they can and can't do when it comes to travel within British Columbia?
Solicitor General.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'll resist the temptation to say, if you want to talk about screw-ups, let's just consider the former member's record when it came to... The Premier and the Health Officer have been very clear. People need to stay local. They need to stay in their own community. And at the same time, right from the get-go with this pandemic, there has been put in place what is essential. What is essential travel, and there's a long and exhaustive list. And so, Honourable Speaker, that is still in place. That has not changed, and it's not going to change, Honourable Speaker. And so I wish, Honourable Speaker, the opposition would just stop this fear-mongering and get on with the fact that we are working as hard as we can to keep British Columbians safe. That is the job of this side of the House, and we will continue to do that.
Okay. Member for Abbotsford South.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. In spite of what we've just heard in this House a few minutes ago, the police are not pleased with the Premier's bungling and lack of consultation. These officers are in the middle of fighting a deadly and escalating gang war, but what does this premier do? He tells the police to divert their focus from fighting crime to fighting campers. This is what the National Police Federation says, and I quote, "Participating in enforcement roadblocks puts even greater pressure on limited resources," end quote. To the Premier, how many police resources will be diverted away from stopping this dangerous gang war in the Lower Mainland?
Solicitor General.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. None.
Member for Abbotsford
So the
South
Premier
on
was
supplemental.
mistaken then. This Premier has no idea what he's doing. Just yesterday, there was a targeted shooting on the front steps of an ice rink in Langley, right next to families and children who were using the play area inside. To make matters worse, most of the officers enforcing the Premier's checkpoints have not been vaccinated yet. The New Westminster Police Officers Association says, and I quote, "We would certainly ask that the government make us a priority for vaccination before they start asking us to enforcing their public health orders," end quote. Question to the Premier. How many unvaccinated police officers will be put at risk on the front lines of the Premier's checkpoints?
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And if any question wanted to show that this opposition is not even interested in the facts or working with people, it is that kind of approach that we are just seeing right now. Honourable Speaker, we have been working with police in terms of how travel restrictions could be put in place, what would be the most effective way to ensure that they work. We have been engaged with ferries to ensure how that would work at terminals, for example. We have been engaged with the tourism industry in terms of dealing with bookings and how that would work, Honourable Speaker. We have been working with the people who actually know what needs to happen and what needs to take place. What the Premier has said is that there will be travel restrictions coming and that we need to have them. And we need to have them to control the virus. And we need to have them to help keep British Columbians safe. That's what we are doing. That's what we're going to continue to do. They will be being briefed tomorrow, and there will be further announcements on what exactly will be taking place tomorrow.
Member for Surrey South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Premier surprised the province with his police checkpoints, people are worried that Black, Indigenous, and people of colour will be racially profiled. The head of the BC Civil Liberties Association, Harsha Walia, has raised concerns. Quote, "The concern is that BIPOC people will face more questioning, more interrogation, have to produce more proof, and will be more likely to face fines in this process," end quote. And that's the problem. Absolutely no one knows what the Premier was thinking, including the Solicitor General and the Minister of Health. So that leaves everybody wondering which BIPOC organizations were consulted on this measure and which ones signed off on the Premier's checkpoints. These groups want to know who's been consulted. Will the Premier answer their very legitimate questions?
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, and I understand very much the concerns of the BIPOC community. And as a matter of fact, after question period, I will be meeting with a number of groups and organizations in terms of hearing from them on the issues around the implementation of travel restrictions.
Member for Shuswap.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. It appears that no one in government understands what the Premier meant to say, including him. The Solicitor General had to try and walk back his comments. Both Dr. Bonnie Henry and the Health Minister have given different advice. And the police have no idea what the Premier is talking about. Now we have the Vancouver Police objecting to enforcing the checkpoints they've been told they will be running. Quote, "The VPD is not conducting random checks for compliance with travel restrictions. We have not seen specific details of these pending restrictions, end quote. And British Columbians who want to do the right thing are confused. It is the Premier who has created this mass confusion. Will the Premier stand up and apologize to British Columbians for creating this unnecessary stress and anxiety?
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I think it's that opposition that needs to stand up and apologize. I think it's that opposition that needs to stand up and apologize to British Columbians for some of the most fear-mongering questions that we have seen. What has been made clear right from the beginning that this is about ensuring the
Members,
safety of British Columbians
order.
by limiting the spread of the virus. It is not about checkpoints in downtown Vancouver. Nobody has told the VPD that they will be doing checkpoints at any point, and to suggest that they have is simply wrong. What has also been clear, this opposition knows full well that they were going to be briefed tomorrow. They were told yesterday that they were going to be briefed. The bottom line is this: you most certainly were. Your leader said to me, "I've written you a letter." I said, "What's it about?" "I want a briefing," she said. I said, "Don't worry, it's in the works. You're going to be briefed." My office contacted your critic. You were told yesterday you
To the chair.
briefed, and you are. So, Honourable Speaker,
Orders.
Honourable Speaker,
Order, members.
This is about public safety. This is about keeping British Columbians healthy and safe and stopping the virus. They may not want to do that. We will, and we are going to do it right.
The bell ends the question period.